the story I wanted to tell you during this particular talk is the global context, as you were saying, okay, of the Anglo-French War that would take place throughout the 18th century. In fact, for more than 120 years, there was this, really violent armed struggle, cultural struggle, also political struggle between the French Empire and the British Empire. In India are not very aware of that. We look at the localized problem that we're talking about, the localized zones of influence. But what it's been very, for me, interesting to realize is how these series of wars that were taking place from the 1740s right through the 1815, finally when Napoleon was defeated at Waterloo, each and every single global war that was taking place between the French and the British had resonance in India, had repercussions physically in the country, in India. So these are just some of this page that lists some of the very important wars, which then would go on to have implications for the Indian theatre. Especially important in all of this is, all of them are extremely important. The First Austrian War succession really gave rise to Duplessis, actions in the south. That's the time that a European-led force defeated a Mughal force for the very first time. We often think that credit goes to Robert Clive at the Battle of Plassey, but it was in the 1740s, in fact, in the south, that Duplessis did this for the very first time. And Robert Clive, in fact, learned from Duplessis' actions and then took those learnings with him to Bengal. Then there was the 7 Years' War, which was also, extremely important, where France and Britain divided their global empires from Canada, America, all the way through the Caribbean, India, Indonesia. The entire, the globe was caught up in this great war in which they divided up their conquest. And for the 7 Years' War, the France started a new sort of war tactic against the British, which was basically war of revenge to block the British wherever they were powerful and use whatever French influence they could to block further advances. So it was very important in that sense for what would continue to happen in India. And one of the key events really was the American Revolutionary Wars. As we know, Britain had 13 colonies in North America. And in 1775 to 1782, these colonies rose up in revolt against the British motherland and gained their independence. And that was a really crucial war for the British because it caused a lot of soul searching. It was, it resulted in almost a feeling of angst with the Britons about what they had done wrong, how they had lost this war, especially since the French had officially backed this war. They had sent soldiers, they had sent materials, they had sent all sorts of help to their American allies. And so this was extremely important in the 1780s for what happens in India, and especially in my book, what happens in Awadh. So these are some of the great wars that happened. Of course, the French Revolution and then the Napoleonic Wars. All of these, in turn, year by year, decade by decade, would show an effect in India, and we discuss it in the book to a great extent. But today we'll just talk on some of the key points so that I can bring out how important these wars were in India. So if you can go to the next slide, I wanted to show you some of the cast of characters, and this is just a small section of the characters involved in my book. There are great many of them, but these are some of the key players from an international cosmopolitan kind of scene. So in the middle, we have the Nawabs, the Nawabs of Awadh. So there's Shuja-ud-Dawla and his son Asaf-ud-Dawla. And most of my book is concerned with the political careers and legacies of these two Nawabs. So Awadh was this large, extremely fertile, rich zone, about 22,000 square miles of very fertile terrain in the Doab region between the two rivers. So between Bengal on one side and Delhi on the other side, right, stretching right up to the Himalayas. So this huge area, which the Nawabs of Awadh had sort of claimed as theirs from the 1720s onwards. So these were Persian immigrants who were given the Subah of Awadh to rule as governors, but they kind of made it a hereditary sort of province, and they carried on ruling it, till 1857. These are the Nawabs at the center of our story, and this is a very famous painting of them by Tilly Kettle, an English artist who came to the Darbar of the Nawabs, and who painted this famous oil painting, which would have a lot of implications for the way in which the Nawabs were then depicted by Indian artists. Around them, you see this cast of characters, and I wanted to use them to show to you how very fluid the boundaries, let us say, between nations were at that time. There was very little, binary in terms of, are you French or are you English? It was quite opaque, and sometimes a character could go from one side to the other quite easily, depending on his allegiances, depending on who was paying more at a certain time, for example. So at the top you have a gentleman called Jean-Baptiste Gentil, and he was an officer. And when Pondicherry was raised during one of these many global battles, the British fought back against French territories by raising Pondicherry. And so a lot of the military officers, the French military officers, then went to various Indian courts looking for employment at some of the rich courts who were willing to hire them. And so Jean-Baptiste Gentil tied his destiny to that of the Nawabs of Awadh, and he was an ally of Shuja-ud-Dawla for 12 years. He was present at the Battle of Buxar, and he was very important in the negotiations that followed between the Nawab of Awadh and the British after that point. So he very firmly thought of himself as a French soldier, and though he was with the Nawab of Awadh, his allegiance was quite clearly with the French, trying to help the Nawab to bolster his defenses, to make him aware of the threat of British incursions, and he was always liaising with the French governors, wherever they happened to be, and with the French king, back in France. So he was very much on the French side, working for the Nawab of Awadh. To the right, there is a character who will be familiar to a lot of Indians. That's Claude Martin, who founded the Martiniere schools later on, in whose name the Martiniere schools were founded. And so he is a much more slippery character. He was a Frenchman from Lyon, a southern city in France, but having been defeated at a battle in Pondicherry, when Pondicherry was raised, he quickly defected to the British side, having decided that that was the surer place to get paid and to have a future as a career man in their East India Company. So he went over to the British very early on, stayed with them throughout his career, but sort of also played the field with the Nawabs, kind of helped them out in many ways. He set up a foundry for them, their arms and ammunition factories in Lucknow. And he was a man who was sort of in between these worlds, because the British were rather snobby about his grasping attitude. He was a bit of a social climber, and so they were quite snobby about him. They never accepted him fully into the British sort of colony, into the British little community. And he felt himself too much of, let us say, he had a slightly disdainful, contemptuous look vis-a-vis the Indians. So he was never really part of any society, and he was a little bit on the fringes of society. Below him is a soldier called René Madette. So he was not an officer, he was just a foot soldier, but a very brave and courageous man who quite quickly joined the Jats. So at this time, the Jats, the Rohillas, the Afghans, all these sort of various clans are also revolting against the Mughal center, which was crumbling in the early 18th century. So he quickly allied himself with the Jats and made quite a name and reputation for himself. But whenever the French called on him, he said, yes, of course, I'm willing to fight for the French, because he was a Frenchman. So his allegiance was also in two places at the same time. Below him is Johann Zoffany, who was an Anglo-German painter, a very interesting man who was at the court of Lucknow and who painted famous conversation pieces, which tell us a lot, which is an important source for writers like myself to understand the society of Lucknow, what was happening, in the Darbar of Lucknow at that time, how the interactions were going on in this cosmopolitan world. Then next we have Benoit de Boigne, who was also a Frenchman, but he was from a region which was at that time the independent Duchy of Savoy. Today it is part of France, but he sort of considered himself an independent man, and he fought mainly for the Marathas. He became a very famous general and the Marathas, and he asked the Marathas to never make him fight against the British, because he had fought with the British early on. But he told the French at the same time that if he ever came upon the British in a battle, then he would fight them. So you can see how very slippery these allegiances were and how easily one side could shift to another side. And finally, we have Antoine Paulier to the top left there, who, despite being a Frenchman, because he was Protestant, found himself more closely allied with the British cause because of their common Protestant background. So often, whether you were Catholic or Protestant was more important than whether you spoke French or English or where you came from, particularly in the world. So this was the cosmopolitan, fractious, constantly changing and evolving sort of cosmopolitan atmosphere within which the Nawabs had to negotiate their changing environment, of which very little remains today. So these paintings are very precious for us in terms of telling us what those palaces would have looked like at that time. You can see this palace is right on the Ghagra River, which the Nawab diverted so that it flowed just below the palace walls. Today, of course, it has shifted back and it's hardly much of a river at all. But in this painting, you see an incident which actually took place, which Gentil talks about in his albums. He writes that one day Shuja was standing on his terrace and he grabbed a musket and shot at a mudka floating by in the river and burst it with one shot. So it's just a testimony to the great skill of the Nawab. But Gentil actually had his painter paint this particular scene, and behind the Nawab, you can see the figure of Jean-Baptiste Gentil himself standing there and other Europeans looking in amazement at the scene. So if you look at this genre of painting, this is very much in the style of the company painting genre, which became in 20 years later on so very popular under Robert Johnson, who is often given, he is given the title of the originator of the company school. So here you can see that the same sort of skills are being used much earlier. So it's Mildred Archer, the art historian, who pointed out this fact that actually it is the French during this time, the 1760s, just after Buxar, when Shuja Daulah has come back to Faizabad, and yet, in fact, this is at Faizabad itself, where this, French officer, Gentil, sets up this karkhana, which starts producing this company style art. And if we go to the next painting, we see that many of his folios, in fact, depict very specific incidents that he talks about in his life. So if we go forward from here, that's right. Yes. So this image is very interesting because it actually shows the very moment in which Jean-Baptiste Gentil himself, that's him in the middle, there's a little figure reaching up to the Nawab on his horse. And he is introducing all these French soldiers who are lined up, to either side. He's introducing these French soldiers to the Nawab, and the Nawab is accepting all of them into his service. So Gentil is careful to commission works which have a resonance about his own life. So clearly, Gentil is commissioning these works to sort of show later on to French patrons back home in France, perhaps the king, perhaps his noblemen, because he has inscribed all of them in French and he has written in his own hand what is happening in each painting, probably because he wanted to show the king how important he had been in the history of Awadh himself personally. And if we look at the next folio, these are close-ups of several images from this same album, which is today at the Victoria and Albert Museum. Yes, this one. So you can see on the top left is a close-up of the painting I was talking to you about earlier. So you see the little figure of Gentil in his blue coat, blue French officer's coat, and he's reaching up now on his horse, and he's telling him about all his soldiers. To the right, you see another very important moment. It's when Jean-Baptiste Gentil, there in the blue coat once again, is talking to another European who is the General Carnac. So General Carnac was the British officer who, after Shuja Daulah was defeated at the Battle of Buxar, it is Karnak who then negotiates with Gentil a treaty to enable the Nawab to regain his lands, to pay an indemnity, and then regain his lands. And so Gentil is showing us that he himself was personally involved in these negotiations. He is talking for Nawab Shuja Daulah, but he is an interlocutor with the Europeans, sort of doing this very important work of diplomacy and getting the Nawab to get back his lands. At the bottom, you see that after a very happy negotiation has been reached, the Nawab is being brought to General Karnak, who is very happy and is embracing him because they have come to an agreement. He has agreed to pay war indemnities, and the land will be given back to Shuja-ud-Dawla. So everybody is happy, including Gentil, who is very proud of his role of interlocutor and diplomat. And nobody else talks about these incidents. If you look at the other biographers of the time, the British certainly don't talk about it. For them, it is, I suppose they prefer not to mention the fact that a French officer was involved in these important negotiations post-Buxar. And it's only in these very precious documents, which are the very first of the Company Kalam paintings, in which Gentil has mentioned his role in a very detailed manner. Then this is what I said to Karnak, this is how I convinced him that Shuja-ud-Dawla is a very important and powerful man. All the other rulers will be up in arms if you depose him from his lands, So all this important information using these very interesting images where you can see that the very typical color palette, which becomes associated with company school, like the pale pinks, the yellows, the greens, all of this is very typical company painting palette. And this has actually started 20 years prior to what is considered the start date in the 1780s. And of course, one little dog there in the middle, we're not sure what he's doing, but clearly an important part of the negotiations as well. So this, in one way, the very important contribution of Jean-Baptiste Gentil to Company School of Painting. If we go on to the next slide. So this is a beautiful folio from a Morocco commissioned by Antoine Polier. Now, Antoine Polier, if you will remember, he was that slightly, fishier character who was never, he was really a chameleon. His allegiance was really only to himself. And he had spies in every court, and he would sell information to whoever paid him the most money at whatever point of time. But he also happened to have a Mughal atelier as well, in which he also commissioned these beautiful albums, which today lie in the Berlin Museum of Islamic Art. I believe 12 complete muraccas or albums of paintings showing different facets of life in India. There are paintings on mythology, on religious practices, on the life and times of people's professions, of various events that happen at the time. And they're really beautifully executed. And you can see as well, just like in Gentil, you can see his personal involvement in the production of these maraccas. He himself is telling his artist. So he has a long correspondence with his main artist, who is a famous painter. He's become famous, more recently when art historians have been writing about him. Malni Roy, for example. This is an artist known as Meher Chand, who painted many of Polier's paintings are commissioned through Meher Chand. It's a very interesting painting which shows the famous moment in Hinduism, which is the churning of the ocean, where they're trying to bring up Amrit for the Devas to have so as to defeat the Asuras. So you can see, how Meher Chand has interpreted this important episode for a European patron, keeping in mind the fact that he will probably show these paintings to a European audience, and what will they make of it? And what is interesting is that Polier has annotated this painting, as he has most of his paintings, in Persian. So he had started annotating in French, but as he becomes more used to the country, as he becomes more immersed in that lifestyle, he's fluent in Persian, in Urdu, as well as French and English. He starts annotating it in Persian, taking on the persona himself of a Persian nobleman. So this is a beautiful and interesting a painting from his Morocco, again showing and substantiating the fact that the French were actually very important patrons of art at this point. And if we can continue to the next image, please. This is another folio commissioned by Antoine Polier. This is also at the Museum of Islamic Arts in Berlin. It is also by Meher Chand. And what is interesting is that it is a portrait of Shuja-ud-Dawla, and it is a copy of the very original. If you remember the first painting I showed you with the Nawabs in the center, in a little circle, a painting by Tilly Kettle. That important oil painting was copied again and again by Indian artists. So Antoine Polier called his artist, called Meher Chand, and showed him Tilly Kettle's original oil painting and said, use this as a template and make more images of the Nawab. I want many images of the Nawab in this style. And you can see how this Indian artist, Meher Chand, has learned so much from looking at all these European paintings. You can see that there's more realism in this painting. You can see the folds of his jama. You can see how lifelike it is compared to the typical, Mughal style painting, which is usually more two-dimensional. You can see the depth of field. You can see far into the horizon, the little trees in the distance. So you can see how Meherchand has taken some of these skills, some of these tools, and adapted it to a completely different genre. Because here you can see the difference with Tilly Kettle's oil painting of the Nawab. Here you can see that Meherchand hasn't really wanted to show this great ruler starkly alone in a setting without any of the accoutrements which would show his, great standing in society. Here, this Indian artist has preferred to show him with an elephant in the background. As we know, elephants are royal mounts. So he has shown this a royal sort of animal in the background. He has also shown two attendants. He didn't want to show the Nawab standing alone, starkly and austerely alone. He has added two of his attendants in the background so that they can use their fly whisk, which were also part of the way in which Mughal artists would always show elite patrons. So I find this painting in particular very interesting because it lets us understand how Indian artists were responding to European art, but then also adapting it and using it for their own purposes, not just a simple copying of some art, but really translating it and transducing it to something entirely new and different. As for the ladies in their jharoka windows on the side, it's not entirely sure who they were. But since Shujauddaulah was a connoisseur of courtesans and, in fact, patronized many courtesans at his court, perhaps these are two of his favorite courtesans that they're showing next to the Nawab. So if we can go to the next image, please. So to come to the importance very quickly, because this is something that I cover in great depth in my book, is the influence of Shujauddaullah's wife Bahu Begum and also his mother Nawab Begum. But here I wanted to show you how an important moment in the Anglo-French Wars, which is in 1775 to 1782, the American Revolutionary Wars were happening in North America. Britain was, caught up in this really expensive, aggressive war in North America, trying to hold on to her 13 colonies, while the French are surreptitiously and then more openly in 1777, they joined the war openly on the American side. They start supplying soldiers and armaments to the Americans. And France and Britain are fighting this proxy war in America, which is ruining Britain. I think their national 74 million pounds to 224 million pounds by the end of the American Revolutionary War. So they are completely in debt by the end of the war. They are really in need of money. What that leads to in India is that Warren Hastings at this time, in fact, immediately when he hears that France has declared her support for America in 1777, he admits to the council in Calcutta that he decided at this point to raise the subsidy on the Raja of Benares. Now, Benares used to be part of Awadh till 1775. Till 1775. Then when Shujauddaulah dies and Asaf becomes king, the British renegotiate a treaty with him and they force him to surrender Benares to them. Now, he really didn't want to do that. The Begums were very clear that they didn't want to relinquish Benares to the British. They were an important part of their territory. Benares was very important to them. But the Hastings leaves them with no choice, and they have to hand over Benares. So in 1777, when war is raging in North America and the Brits are in desperate need of money, Warren Hastings decides to raise some of that money through the Raja of Benares. And while the Raja had been paying a subsidy every year for the honor of ruling his own country, suddenly in 1777, Warren Hastings says, you must pay an additional war subsidy because we need money for our war in America. So the Raja finds this quite egregious and he refuses to do this. This leads to Warren Hastings coming to Benares, imprisoning the Raja, and the Raja, this results in a huge revolt in the city of Benares. Raja Chet Singh is rescued from the prison that he was in. He is taken away, and the whole city and then the whole countryside of Awadh erupts in insurrection. And this is very important because the Begums, Bahu Begum and Nawab Begum, are both supporting this insurrection. Not only are they supporting it, they are sending out their Khwaja Saras, they are sending out their eunuchs to raise soldiers, to raise money, to tell people to join in this insurrection. And the whole of the countryside is told to rise up in revolt, and they do so. And this is a very important moment that we are not often told about. I was recently listening to a talk by Professor P. Sainath, who talks about the fact that from the very time that the British started taking over land in India, there are insurrections and revolts from the very start, and we are not told this. We are told that more or less the Indians accept what is coming and it is for their own good, and they somehow seem to acquiesce in this entire movement. But Professor Sainath had mentioned this, and when I looked at my own sources, I realized that this was completely true in Awadh, that there was violent reaction when the British tried to do certain things that the people found completely unfair or much too aggressive. So in this case, the Begums led this revolt. Hastings was furious, and he orders the eunuchs to be imprisoned for almost 2 years' time to try and put pressure on the Begums to give up their treasure to the British. But the Begums hold out for the whole of this period. They refuse to part with their treasure because they know that their money, their treasure is their power. Without their money, they are nothing. So they refuse for this entire time. Hastings gets more and more angry, and he tries through every means possible till finally there is a huge outcry back home in England when they come to know that Hastings is using these kind of methods against elite women in India, women who are parda bound, who should be not available for this kind of aggression. And Hastings is called back to England. He has to go back in 1785, and he has to face a trial for impeachment, which lasts for 7 years. So I wanted to bring about the fact that, in a sense, it is Bahu Begum. It is the fact that a war is happening against the French, which is causing so much trouble to the British, that a man like Warren Hastings, the Governor General, is recalled to England and has to face this trial. And it is the end of his career. It is the fact that these women were able to mobilize so many resources, so many soldiers, so much insurrection in their name, that Warren Hastings was in fact recalled, and that was the end of his career in India. So that is meant to be a painting of Bahu Begum. Of course, it is not an actual painting because she was a parda-bound woman. Nobody knew what she looked like, and no painter would have had the audacity to show her as she is shown in this painting. But it is supposed to be a 19th century painting. The other painting I'm interested in because it is a beautiful depiction of a zanana at that time in the 1780s. It's painted by an Indian painter, Nevasi Lal, who worked for Gentil as well. And he's painted this beautiful, busy scene in a zenana where two elite women are playing chess and their entourage is around them. There are milk mothers feeding children, there are children playing, there are attendants bringing food, bringing in all kinds of things. There are Khwaja Saras standing around. And as you know I wrote an earlier book called Daughters of the Sun, where I try to show the Zanana as this busy place where women are involved in all sorts of aspects of their busy lives, cultural aspects, political aspects, and it is not at all the eroticized harem of European imagining. So I like this painting, and I wanted to show it to you because it does bring about that sense of a busy, ordered life that they were having. So if we can go on to the next painting, please, or next slide rather. Okay, so this is very interesting because these are a group of paintings that lie today at the Kew Gardens outside London. And they were commissioned, it is believed, by Claude Martin. We know Claude Martin for many other reasons. We know him for the buildings he commissioned. We know him for the great work he had for the La Martiniere schools that he endows, for the commercial interests he had. But we don't know him as much as a patron of these beautiful botanical arts. And I find these really interesting because they were painted really early on, again, probably in the 1770s, it is believed. So, again, before the famous British patrons like Elijah Impey and his wife, Lady Impey, Robert Johnson, all the other famous commissioners of botanical art. This was actually a Frenchman who was doing this uh, quite a bit earlier. And there are hundreds of them, hundreds of paintings of Indian plants, mostly of commercial interest. So plants that can be useful, which have medicinal value or have commercial value of some sort. And if you look at the painting on the right, so you can see the name in Urdu on the left. So that would have been the Indian name, which on the right is translated as the Har or the Halhal. So that is what the Indian mustard was called. That is the Indian name of it. Below it, you have the Latin name for the first time. And so this is a fascinating moment. It's a liminal moment where you have these Indian plants, in their Indian setting. They have been transposed onto this paper, and they have literally, their form is changing and becoming a Latinized, useful plant, which will completely change the way in which we actually interact with this plant. Now, again, I was listening to Professor Sainath speaking about this, and he said that apart from the loss of lives that the British Empire resulted apart from the loss of money that is extracted, there's this huge cost in the agroeconomic sense, because what the British did was they brought in rice and wheat to be cultivated because these were the only plants that they were familiar with. And all the things that we used to cultivate before, all the cereals, the complex cereals that we used to eat, were given to the animals. They became fodder for animals. So we have names like the cowpea, the horse gram, the chickpea. Why are they called these names? Because they were fed to chickens, to cows, to pigs, to horses. They were not consumed. They were not deemed good enough for humans anymore. So instead of having these low glycemic index cereals which we used to consume beforehand, we started eating wheat and rice, which led to all sorts of problems. So these botanical paintings, interestingly, really resonated with me when I was listening to Professor Sainath, because you can see this process taking place right here in front of our eyes in 1770s. These particular plants going from becoming the halhal to the Latin name of it, so it changes identity completely. So a very fascinating piece of art, which is unfortunately out of the reach of most Indian readers because they have not been digitized. They're lying in the Kew museums. Hopefully they will digitize them one day. But I've used a few in my book so that people can admire these. And if we go to the next slide, please. So I wanted to show you in very short form, really, the importance of the French in helping Shuja-ud-Dawla in terms of architecture, defensive architecture, because we see, if you can see to the top left, this terrible map that I found. I could not find any map of Faizabad. We had to recreate a new map to show what I wanted to show in my book. But this is all I could find online. Everyone seems to have forgotten about Faizabad, and there are very few maps out there. But if you can see that funny star-shaped thing on the top left of the map, and which is called Fort Calcutta on the map, it is actually a fascinating star-shaped defensive fort in the French Vauban style of architecture, which Shuja-ud-Dawla commissioned from a French architect called Emmanuel Canaple. So it is said from the writing that we are able to find at that time, a scholar called Banmali Tandon has done some work on this. And I have shown for comparison the fort that exists today still in Mandrabad Fort in Karnataka, because today there's nothing extant in Faizabad. We cannot see even the ruins or anything left of this fort. But the writings affirm that a star-shaped huge fort was being commissioned by Shuja-ud-Dawla by a Frenchman, and he had almost finished it by the time Shuja-ud-Dawla died, and then I suppose it fell to ruin after this and was not used. But it was a huge defensive structure which have been of great importance to the if they have been able to mount, physical resistance to the sort of incursions that happened to them later. And of course, this is just one aspect of the huge military help that the French were able to give Shuja'ud-Dawla at this time from 1765, post Buxar onwards, till 1775 when he dies. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Okay, for this, I wanted to tell you a little bit about a different part of India. So this is Mysore and this is Tipu Sultan. And I think out of all the rulers in India in the 18th century, it was really the rulers of Mysore, Hyder Ali and then Tipu Sultan, who were truly aware of the importance of the French and of their global struggle vis-a-vis the British. And this is true because Hyder Ali, from the time of Dupleix, was able to have a first-hand, he saw for himself how Dupleix was able to fight the Nawab of the Carnatic and how he fought the British. And so Hyder Ali was extremely aware of French influence, of French capability, and how they were the enemies of the British. Very few other Indian rulers at that time realized this. In fact, to the great horror of French travelers, they found that regular Indians, regular folk in Delhi could not even make out the difference between all these Firangis. They thought they were one nation and they were all the same. No, very few rulers actually understood the intricacies of these, Anglo-French interactions of their battles. But Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan did, and they maintained tight diplomatic relations with the French throughout the 18th century, uniquely for any ruler in India. And in 1788, Tipu Sultan sent an embassy from India to the court of Louis XVI. He sent 3 men and their entourage, sent them to France, asking for military assistance, but also asking his ambassadors to bring back specimens of whatever they could find, and asking the king to send back examples of whatever he had in terms of ceramics, unusual things like wallpaper. They were very impressed with the wallpaper being produced at that time, with pottery, with ceramics, with glass, with plants, commercial plants, with all kinds of things, in addition to, of course, arms and armament technology. So these 3 ambassadors, when they reached the court of Louis XVI, they caused an enormous stir. People were extremely excited, and they apparently followed them wherever they walked along the boulevards. They were followed by all kinds of eager and inquisitive people. And you can see on the right a French artist, a woman artist, Elisabeth Vigée, painted this astonishing portrait of one of the ambassadors. And you can see, compared to the way in which the British were talking about Mysore and Tipu Sultan, they were talking about him as this blood crazy despot and this sort of tyrant. Here you can see that this French painter has painted this man as a very elegant, virile person, and on the same level as she would an elite Frenchman, for example. So you see far less prejudice in the way in which she is interpreting this ambassador. On the left is an engraving that was produced at around this time, and this is meant to show, in the central character on the top is meant to be Tipu Sultan himself. Obviously, this looks nothing like Tipu Sultan at all. He has a beard, this person, and he looks more like the Ottoman Sultan. So clearly the French themselves are not terribly sure what Tipu Sultan looks like, what Mysore is all about. What's interesting is that they show him on a par with other, not showing him in any derogatory light. They are not. They have far less prejudice about these, Indian ambassadors and rulers than the British had at the same time. So they are showing these men as important elite men in their own right. So this very important embassy that Tipu Sultan sent was the first by an Indian ruler to a European court. Unfortunately, the timing was terribly bad because within a year, the French Revolution would break out, and nobody in France was in any position to offer any kind of help to Tipu Sultan whatsoever. And if we carry on to the next slide, please. Yes, so I think this is my last slide, and I just wanted to make a point about all these wars that we have been talking about, the Anglo-French wars that were taking place throughout the 18th century, they really shaped the way in which the British thought of themselves, because Britain started off at the beginning of the 18th century as a tiny island nation, half the population of the French, a tiny force, much less politically powerful, much less economically vibrant than the French. So they always had this sense of danger at their doorstep, that the great French Catholic menace would one day come and invade the small island nation. So they shaped their national character as austere, as Protestant, vis-a-vis the French Catholic, excessive, extravagant Louis the 16th image or the Napoleonic image. So here you can see on the top, top left, Warren Hastings, often portrayed as this austere, scholarly man, despite the fact that actually he took a lot of bribes. His wife took a lot of bribes. They returned to England with a lot of money. But in at least overtly, there were these very sober examples of Protestant rectitude. Same for the picture below. Hastings, which is of another Governor General, John Shaw, also shown as this very austere, Protestant evangelical man. Whereas the Napoleon on the right is shown in all his grandiose, ostentatious ceremony. And what is interesting is that when Napoleon came to power in the late 18th century and started celebrating the revolution and then his rise to power with these very over-the-top ceremonies, these very grand ceremonies that all of the French nation was caught up in celebrating, the British felt that they had to do something similar to unite all the British peoples. So they decided, in opposition to the French uh, Catholic sort of excessive manner of celebrating, they would sort of have all of their national celebration around the figure of the monarch. So they brought the figure of the monarch in the center of all their national celebrations, and they brought out some pretty archaic and in some cases, they invented some of their, traditions and rituals, uh, and they set it up sort of in opposition to the French. So these continue even today. So when you see some of the celebrations around, for example, the death of Queen Elizabeth last year, and all of the many rituals that were carried out over weeks and weeks, and which some of them seem, to be very arcane, these hark back to the 18th century when the Brits were reacting to the French excess and the French Napoleonic sort of extravaganza. So what is interesting for me is that a lot of what we see today, even in Brexit, sometimes we are so surprised on the continent to imagine that the Brits would vote for Brexit. But actually, it dates back to events in the 18th century when they kind of sort of hunkered down on themselves and decided to keep the French at bay, decided that the French were this great Catholic menace that must be kept at bay at all costs. So today, when you see something like Brexit happening, it makes more sense in the context of the 18th century.
That really does put in some perspective there. Thank you so much.
Thank
Uh,
you.
I'm going to start by echoing Jyoti's question. She, I think, somewhere in the middle said, "Tell us a little bit about what Lion and the Lily stand for." So,
The name?
the name.
Yeah. So the lily is the French so that was lily flower, which was used by on the banner of France, the royal banner before the revolution. So, of course, in 1789, it was replaced by the rosette, the revolutionary rosette. But right up till that point, it was the lily of France, which was used by people like René Madec. When he led his soldiers into battle in India, he would have the banner of the fleur de lis, the lily of France. And the lion, so in India, as you know, we use the word sher interchangeably for lion and tiger. So Tipu Sultan, for example, used the symbology of the tiger very extensively in all of his paraphernalia, in all of his, courtly enactments, because I think his patron was Imam Ali, who was supposed to be the lion, who had the title the Lion of God. So the Lion of God was used by a number of Indian rulers because of its association with Imam Ali.
Lovely. So, of course, Vidhi starts by saying that she's read your book on Akbar and just loved it, and lots of people are complimenting the talk and whatever you've spoken so far. We started, I think, with the paintings, and I think the paintings were really interesting, especially in the way you broke them down into detail and, sort of helped us focus on some of that. But because these paintings were being done by Jean-Pierre, do you think that there was any sense of exaggeration in what he put, or were these, sort of more truer to form kind of artwork?
So that's always a difficult question, to answer completely, because obviously we have to see who he's making these for, and he's clearly making this for the king in France, for an elite audience. So what he definitely wants to do is to show himself in the best possible light, is to glorify his role. In the politics of Awadh, and how he was able to bring out this reconciliation post Buxar. So we have to always keep that in mind, who is the intended viewer of these commissions. But even given that, there is enough, I think, corresponding material to let us say with some degree of confidence that these events did take place. And even if Gentil was probably not as central a character as he would like us to imagine, he was definitely involved. And it was definitely in British interest to not talk about that involvement.
And I guess it's like any other book written in history, right? I mean, the author's veracity is very hard
Yeah,
to check. Yeah.
exactly.
Of course, we all had a little moment where we admired the dog a little bit more than maybe we should have. But thank you for sort of blowing that up for us and giving us that moment. Thank you. Um, there is, of course, we've got Jyoti's question. But yeah, there's a lot of comments about the Nawab Zangraka. I think seeing these paintings up close and personal also helps you reconnect back to the attire and and how they're rendered together. So thanks for that.
Yeah.
I think someone had a question about the seven-headed horse, and I did say it was the one that was created in the Manthan. I hope I'm right.
Yes,
Yeah, and
that's right.
I think that you answered the question about the royal ladies' paintings by saying that this was a 19th century rendition rather than anyone
Yes.
daring to paint them up. But of course, I think what's really coming out in all the questions is that just the placement of the French in Awadh is something that we don't have associations in our mind other than the La Martiniere school. So there's so much more, that you have brought together for us. And of course, we also all had a moment when you shared the Glory Lily and the mustard paintings, because, there's also the sense of loss at one that we don't have any of these paintings of our
Yes.
biodiversity within the country.
Yes.
A part of me is very grateful to the French and the British for having, sort of at least documented some of that. But the fact that we don't have
Yes.
it is very sad. And then the second part is the sadness at having lost some of that biodiversity to the, wheat and rice.
Absolutely.
Wheat and rice culture. So, can you share any sources where we can sort of see more of this stuff? Because I think there were some questions.
Yes. So, if you buy my book, you will find a lot. I have, of course, written extensively on the footnotes where you can find everything.
Okay.
Some of them are completely out of reach, like I was saying. Unfortunately, the Q collection, which is marvelous, and I went there in person, and they very kindly brought out all the paintings for me to see, and I've taken pictures of some hundreds of them because I just had this sense of they are beautiful, firstly, and they are big. They are about like 3 feet by 2 feet. They are big, beautiful works of art. They are not as yet digitized. I mean, I can, of course, people can email me. I can share some of these with people. I have got some in my books so that people can see them. But these are otherwise quite, unfortunately, out of the reach of scholars and lay people at the moment. Hopefully, they will be digitized soon. The ones in Berlin, those are absolutely stunning. I was lucky enough again to go to Berlin and to look at all these collections myself, and they are stunning. They are stunning late 18th century muracas, which we have very few of. We are often told in the late 18th century there are no albums, there are no proper muracas, but they are there in Berlin. Luckily, these are being digitized very soon. The curators are doing a wonderful job. They're trying to get these images out there for people. So I think if you look up Islamic Museum in Berlin, you'll be able to find a lot online.
Wonderful. Actually, that brings me to a question I've had. You know, you started by telling us about how he moved from annotating in French or English to Persian. So that that was sort of a generation of people learning many languages, and especially those who came to India and sort of adopted. But it must have been an equally hard process for you in your research to also look out for, you know, these sources which might well have been in French and German. So could you tell us a little bit about that?
So, yes, absolutely. This was a very polyglot environment, a cosmopolitan environment. People routinely spoke at least three, if not four languages and wrote in those languages. But luckily, I was able to, so, I'm able to read and write French. And that was a great advantage for me because I specifically did want to use French sources just to show a counter narrative, to the British, because we have sort of, inherited the British colonial point of view in a lot of our history writing. And to push back against that, I thought one way would be to use French sources because obviously they have a different take on most of these episodes. So wherever possible, I use French letters, French biographies, French memoirs, French correspondence, with British agents, and all of these. So some are easily available at the British Library. Some lie in personal family records. So, like all of the one's letters. So the gentleman who fought for the Marathas, he passed through Lucknow and had a liaison with a BB, and he had a BB from Lucknow. So I was interested in him for that reason. So he has family archives in Chambéry, in their family museum and archive. So I was able to access that and find his letters in French. But yes, it has been quite a journey physically as well, and linguistically to kind of go through all of these things. In Persian, I cannot read, unfortunately, so I have to get the translations.
Okay. Of course, everyone loved the Sabira says she loved the etymology of the chickpeas, horse gram, etc. It's always great, you know, that moment of
Realization.
realization that pigweed is coming from a certain source. And of course, now people have gone on to talk about how they loved your other books, like Daughters of the Sun. And Jyoti says that her favorite is Heroine and Daughters of the Sun. Amar Gatta has a point saying there was a book in Urdu which was a local for the local khansama in Lucknow that was for French cuisine written in late 1800s. He saw a copy in the Rampur library, and he was told that these books were translated so that the khansama could cook and cater for the French guests as needed. So, are these books available still? There would be such a delight to.
They would. I had heard about this, and I did some research to find it, but I wasn't able to find it very easily. It's not available online, and Rampur is quite opaque in their dealings. So to get to any of their resources is quite hard. Unfortunately, some of the Indian museums and libraries are actually more difficult to access than say the British Library. Where it is fairly easily for even a non-professional scholar to just get access to. So I was not able to get much further in this particular book, which I have heard about this book, but I was not able to source it.
But of course, Amar, if you can find us a way to this library or this book, I'm
Yeah.
sure we'd be happy to see, and so would. Imran says that he's expecting many more paintings in your book, which you promised us that there will be. So we're all looking to go out and get your book now. Jyoti wants to know what art did the ambassadors get back to Tipu Sultan?
That's a very good question. I don't think that there were paintings, but there was an entire ceramic set, with the painted ceramic tea set sort of thing, like with dozens and dozens of ceramic pieces, because the ceramic factory was really at that time state of the art technology he had. Actually, it was very funny because the ambassadors wrote and said, that we have been feasted and dined by these merchants, by these factory owners. And it is very interesting that factory owners in France, banias, are like they are like the rulers in India. They have as much money and wealth as a ruler would in India. So they considered them banias, and they were very impressed by how much money these merchants and these tradespeople had. So they sent back this entire ceramic set, which, if I am not wrong, was then the fall of Seringapatam was then captured by the British and taken back to England, and I think is in one of the British museums, either the V&A or the British Museum.
Wonderful. Sita did mention that the collection of botanical paintings is a great one, but there's an update from her that Martin's Indian botanical paintings are being digitized at Kew as we speak, and Kew is going to have an
Fantastic.
exhibition in 2025, which will include these Lucknow paintings and the chickpeas, and we're trying to bring back
Fantastic.
the facsimiles to India in a set of exhibitions in 2026. And she would love to be in touch with you as this develops. And she's going to keep all of us at Khaki Lab posted as well. So that sounds really interesting.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that with us. I'm really happy to hear that because, Indian audience will be just delighted to see these beautiful paintings.
Yeah, I'm personally looking forward to seeing some of this. So thank you so much for telling us about it. Amar has an update about the book. He said this was for a food show that he was researching, and he was lucky to get access for the show. And the lady they shot within Lucknow had a copy too. If we need any contact for the Rampur library or the lady in Lucknow, he has it. So Amar, will you get back,
Oh,
connect
wow.
us
Yeah.
at Kaki Lab, and we'll share the information with the
Thank you.
Ira as well. That was a lovely talk, all in all. Thank you so much on behalf of our audience and everyone at Kaki
Thank
Lab.
you.
Thank you so much, and thank you to everyone for joining in and participating. And I love the fact that we had, sharing from all sides, and audience putting in so much information back into the talk as well. It feels very enriching. Loved your presentation. Thank you, everyone,
Thank you.
and see you all next Saturday.